Today I'm going to present material on a subgenre of Romantic literature called Gothic. This genre continued on past the boundaries of the Romantic movement, and we discussed elements of the Gothic in Dracula last week. Just to review, the Romantic movement, which was most popular from the late 1700s to the mid-1800s, was an artistic rebellion against the focus on science and reason so championed in the Enlightenment. The Gothic movement is known as an aesthetic movement because it appears not only in literature but also in art and architecture. You see a Romantic painting on this slide, the famous 1818 Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog by German artist Caspar David Friedrich. In terms of Romantic music, think about the classical composer Beethoven. The first Gothic art pieces were actually a house and a landscaped garden. Horace Walpole's Strawberry Hill estate, located just outside of London in Twickenham. Walpole renovated this house in 1747, adding medieval elements. Let's pause here a moment and look at the architecture that was mainly popular in the 18th century, which was neoclassical architecture, as you see in this example of Chatsworth's house in Derbyshire, UK. Here is Strawberry Hill near London, and you see that they have added Gothic elements after the fact, if you will, with the turrets and the round tower. At its heart, the Gothic movement can be understood as a kind of medieval revivalism, at least in Europe. Artists working in the Gothic aesthetic embrace the architecture and literature from before the Enlightenment. According to the Norton Anthology of English Literature, Romantic period readers use the Gothic as, quote, a way to describe accounts of terrifying experiences in ancient castles and ruined abbeys, experiences connected with subterranean dungeons, secret passageways, flickering lamps, screams, moans, ghosts, and graveyards. In the long run, the Gothic became a label for the macabre, mysterious, supernatural, and terrifying, especially the pleasurably terrifying, close quote. We've already encountered many of these settings and elements in Dracula so far. Let's see, ancient castles, check. Ruined abbeys, check. Graveyards, check. In using medieval settings, these Gothic writers could find a place for the dark, mysterious, and emotionally wrought tales that made sense to readers, in a way. Because readers might not be able to picture the evil monks, disguised princes, and evil rulers in their own contemporary world, the medieval settings of Gothic tales provided a location for these elaborate and dark tales. Horace Walpole, whose father is considered by many to have been the first true Prime Minister of Britain, again shows himself to be a visionary, not just with landscape, gardening, and architecture, but with medievalism and the Gothic in literature. Walpole published the first Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto, in 1764. Here's the blurb on that work from the Norton Anthology to English Literature, the Romanticism volume. When the story opens, the villainous Manfred, Prince of Otranto, to get an heir to his estate, has arranged a marriage between his only son Conrad and the beautiful Isabella. But on his wedding day, Conrad is mysteriously killed, victim of a giant helmet that falls from the sky and crushes him. Lest he be left without male descendants, Manfred determines to divorce his present wife, Hippolyta, who is past childbearing age, and marry Isabella himself. Isabella learns of his intention and decides to flee the castle by night. Can you picture why this novel became such a sensation? It's very short, by the way, and maybe worth a read if you're in the mood for something spooky and slightly strange. Gothic literature, unlike realism, which is the literary movement that comes next, is not really concerned with being true to life, but instead seeks to become a reclamation of the primitive emotions of fear and wonder provided by the romances of the pre-Enlightenment age, according to The Gothic and the Development of Mass Readership, page 514. As you can tell from this quote, Gothic literature, like Romanticism in general, was a rebellion against the Enlightenment, with its focus on science and ideas above feelings. Unlike the broader Romantic movement, the Gothic subgenre featured women writers quite prominently. Some of the most famous Gothic women novelists include Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, and Anne Radcliffe, who wrote The Mysteries of Udolpho, among others. Even Jane Austen, beloved for her psychological realism, wrote a Gothic spoof, Northanger Abbey, about a young girl whose obsession with Gothic novels leads her to misjudge others. Gothic literature, although an outgrowth of Romanticism, was not universally praised by the Romantic writers. Influential Romantic poets William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge were not fans, to put it lightly. This may seem weird to us because Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner certainly contains Gothic elements like ghosts and terror. Some of this criticism may spring from notions of high versus low culture. In other words, those Romantic poets might have been a bit snobby due to the popularity of Gothic fiction and its mass appeal to all social classes. Gothic literature has several distinct features, many of which also appear in Southern Gothic works. In Gothic works, the setting has a powerful effect on the plot, to the extent that it operates almost as a character. These settings could be urban or rural, but they definitely have a scary edge to them. Two of the short stories that you're reading for this week definitely fit into having a very influential setting. Gothic novels often feature castles prominently, and many times these castles are in some state of disrepair. Nature, in Gothic and Romantic works, is beautiful but scary force. It is what the Romantic writers call the sublime. So picture an erupting geyser, an avalanche, a storm at sea, a windswept mountain, the painting wanderer above the sea of fog that I showed you earlier, instead of a peaceful meadow populated by hopping bunnies and wildflowers. Isolation is a big theme in Gothic literature, and characters may be isolated geographically. For instance, they could live in a castle on a cliff far out in the country. They could be isolated socially, cut off from friends and family, or psychologically, where they feel alone, even if they are around others. The characters in Gothic literature experience intense emotions. Wuthering Heights, an English novel by Emily Bronte, depicts this aspect of Gothic literature quite effectively. Gothic literature also features certain character types, like the fallen hero, the woman as victim, a virginal heroine, and a villain or tyrant that is responsible for the evil in the book. Common themes explored by Gothic literature include light versus dark, repression, the desire for forbidden knowledge, and the weight of history, which means a wrong done in the past or an old family secret. I've listed some famous examples of Gothic literature here, although there are many more. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, the works, short stories, and poems of Edgar Allan Poe, which we have been reading the past few weeks. Wuthering Heights, which I mentioned earlier. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. This is a Gothic story with an urban setting. And, pictured, Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, which was written in the 1900s. This is a great read, by the way, if you're in the mood to be deliciously scared. I want to say a few words about how Gothic literature was interpreted in the U.S. because of all our readings this week are actually American Gothic stories, although some are not set in the U.S. Sometimes the Gothic form in the U.S. is considered a regional form, like Southern Gothic. I'm not going to say anything more about Southern Gothic in this lecture because we have a group that has taken over that topic and I don't want to steal their thunder. Suffice it to say, the Southern Gothic group should look into how Southern Gothic uses some Gothic elements. So how do you have a Gothic tale in a land with no ruined castles or ancient superstitions? According to Charles Brockden Brown, American Gothic replaces ruined castles and superstition with, quote, Indian hostility and the perils of the western wilderness, close quote. Charles Brockden Brown wrote a delightful short Gothic novel called Wieland that I read more than a decade ago. I also recommend it. It contains a ventriloquist, so how could it not be creepy? There was definitely some literary snobbery going on in the U.S. concerning this subgenre titled Gothic. perhaps influenced by Wordsworth and Coleridge's disdain. Nathaniel Hawthorne called his stories romances instead of Gothic literature. But this story harkens back to King Arthur stories and other medieval tales, so there is that element, that medieval revival element, still in the name that Nathaniel Hawthorne chose. A final note about American Gothic versus European Gothic. Whereas European Gothic often contains a social class element and looks outward, American Gothic can be said to turn inward to the psychological and the theological, or as Tessa H. Gaudu puts it, quote, the hidden blackness of the American soul, close quote. I hope you enjoy getting a little spooked out by this week's readings of 3 American Gothic classics. The Birthmark by Nathaniel Hawthorne from 1843. The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe from 1847. And Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper from 1890. That's all for this lecture. I hope you enjoy the reading this week.